Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man. Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
Hey, welcome to another episode of the Muscle Expert Podcast. I am your host, Ben Pakulski, and today we're going to dive into the ketogenic diet with the king of keto himself, Dominic D'Agostino. So for those of you that don't know what the ketogenic diet is, it's a diet rich in fat, saturated fat, monounsaturated fats, some polyunsaturated fats, a little bit of protein, and as low possible as carbohydrate as we can get. And what that does is it tricks our body into using fat for fuel. So historically, evolutionarily, human beings have two types of fuel we can use. We can use glycogen, which is from carbohydrate, or we can use ketones from fat. But in modern society, we're so adapted to always having carbohydrates. We have carbohydrates every couple hours. We're so used to eating, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day. Blood glucose is always elevated. Therefore, the body becomes very inefficient at using fat because it doesn't need to. So this ketogenic diet has become a really, really big thing lately in allowing us to actually become better adapted to use fat for fuel. Now, there's a transition phase that's going to happen. There's a 3 to 8 week phase where your body's still going to want to prefer glycogen. And it's a pretty uncomfortable phase for some people. So when your body's shifting from using glycogen to fuel to using ketones for fuel, there can be a little bit of a lull in your blood sugar. You can tend to feel a little bit of brain fog. You can tend to feel a little bit slow. And most people will start the ketogenic diet and stop in a week or 3 weeks often because they just don't feel right. Like, I don't feel good, it doesn't work for me. The reality is you just haven't adapted to using fat for fuel yet. And what are the benefits of using fat for fuel? Well, obviously, then when you bring your dietary fat consumption down, your body can start now really, really effectively and efficiently using your stored fat for fuel rather than using protein breakdown to fuel energy production. Protein breakdown obviously being muscle tissue. We want to save muscle tissue, use fat. So I'm very interested in this ketogenic diet. I've actually been following a high-fat diet for the better part of 5 years, but never gone fully into ketosis. And now I am, and I'm trying it, and I'm experimenting with a lot of things. So I've got a really unique perspective when I dive into this conversation with Dominic D'Agostino. Ketogenic diet also has some really interesting implications as far as cancer, as far as autism, and many, many things that Dominic D'Agostino discusses in this podcast. And Dominic, like I say, is probably the king of keto. He's the guy around the world known for literally selling out Whole Foods because he recommended eating Wild Planet sardines. He sold out Whole Foods across the country. So this guy's got some impact. He's got some reach. And if you want to learn about what this diet does, and maybe more importantly, how to mitigate that first, keto flu, that feeling of, I don't feel really good from this ketogenic diet. If you learn how to mitigate that, this is your guy. And I'm really trying to ease that process for people because I really believe, even if you don't want to go into ketosis long term, I really believe it's a massive advantage for every human to go through a phase of fat adaptation. So when I start a coaching program with somebody, if somebody's working with me one-on-one, the first thing we do for the first 4 weeks is we decrease inflammation and adapt them to fat because that just allows us the opportunity to bring their blood sugar down. If we bring your blood glucose down a little bit by restricting carbohydrates, all of a sudden your body is really, really effective and efficient at burning fat for fuel. So guess what? It's almost like you can watch fat come off. That's a really cool place to be. It takes time to get there, and most people don't want to go through the uncomfortable phase to get there. So, lucky for us, Mr. Dominic D'Agostino is here to tell us how to mitigate that and to also start understanding the physiology of what's happening in the body and all the other massive implications in our long-term health and how we can optimize our body and our mind. You're going to love this conversation with Dominic. He actually did it right here with me in the gym. So it actually ends up being a really nice organic flow and talk about a wealth of information. I could have sat here for another 3 hours with him and talked about it, but I tried to be respectful of his time. With that being said, if you're someone who's interested in getting started on a ketogenic diet, Thrive Market is a sponsor of the Muscle Expert Podcast. And Thrive is an awesome place that I've been using for just over 6 months because we're busy. Time is scarce, and time is our most valuable asset. So I've just been doing all of my shopping online. It gets delivered right to my door. Why not? And especially for the things that are heavy, like your fats. So if you're someone who has to go and buy olive oil and buy coconut oil and buy nuts and things like this, it's a very easy and convenient thing to have them shipped right to your door. Cool thing about Thrive Market, over 70% of their products aren't available on Amazon. A lot of us order on Amazon, myself included. They're also going to give you 25 to 50% below typical retail. So if you're someone who's shopping at your typical grocery store, you're actually going to get substantially better rates on Thrive Market, which is awesome. They've also got Wild Planet sardines, which Dominic recommends. They've got sardines, they've got salmon. So the foods that are really, really rich in great fats are going to be your wild meats, like wild-caught fish and wild-caught game, or also grass-fed beef. And Thrive Market now actually sells those. So definitely, if you're interested in the ketogenic diet, one of the best places you can go to get all your stuff and get it delivered is Thrive Market. So a huge shout out to them. So for all of the listeners in the Muscle Expert podcast, you guys are going to get 25% off your very first order and a free 30-day trial for you to use as many times as you like in the first 30 days, which is awesome and badass. So you're getting free food. Why not? And it's delivered to you for free. So check it out. And the only way to check it out, there's no discount code necessary. You got to go to thrivemarket.com/muscleexpert. And then you can give me a high five and a fist bump later, because this place is awesome. It's a really, really great site that has really great products. And truthfully, about 25% savings off what you're going to pay in the grocery store. So with that being said, enjoy the podcast with Dominic D'Agostino, the King of Keto. So one of the biggest issues with ketones, and I want you to touch on this, is well below your level of expertise, but I want you to touch on this. So you're saying 8 to 12 weeks to adapt to a ketogenic diet, and that's obviously variable person to person, depending on your liver health, depending on your amount of muscle tissue, depending on your health. Yeah. What are some strategies people can start implementing to shift it? Is it just a matter of is it starting slow with low amounts of fat and keeping the protein moderate and then bringing the fats up and the protein down? Or is it the opposite, where you start really low protein and just like force your body to go pure ketogenic?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Or is it fasting, or is it exercise, or what are some of the levers we can pull? Because everyone's like, man, I don't want to wait 8 weeks to be in ketosis. Yeah. I actually want to get the benefits now. So is it, I'll let you know with that.
That's a really good question. I was actually on a exchange of emails over the last couple of days by the top leaders in this field, like guys that have been in it decades before I got into it. Yeah. And we were pulling off some of the information, lesser known information about metabolic physiology studies, stuff that they did back in the 60s and 70s that they don't really do now. That might be unethical in different ways, and looking at that. My take of the literature is that if someone's going into ketosis, you do have accelerated protein catabolism the first no less than three weeks into it. You are, if you look at things like 3-methylhistidine or catabolic biomarkers, your protein turnover rates are accelerated that first 3 weeks. For an athlete, that translates, in my opinion, I can do keto and stay 1 gram per kilogram per day. And actually, probably if I titrate the calories, I could probably be anabolic and start gaining muscle. But when you're
1 gram per kilogram of protein?
1 gram per kilogram, of protein per day. So just talking about protein now. So for me, like right at 100 kilograms, it's 100 grams of protein a day. That's like a teeny tiny amount of what I used to get, 300-400 on some days. Right. And I could grow on that if I get the calories in enough. But when you're starting keto, especially if you're at a calorie deficit, you want to keep the protein about, and this is an exchange of a number of emails. It's a general consensus of the experts is that about 1.25 to 1.5 minimum, and maybe 1.5 probably being the upper end of that per kilo. If you are on, most people are doing keto to lose weight. If you're are on dietary energy restriction, like you need to up the protein calories to offset that catabolism, a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks into it, because you're going to be losing a lot of muscle. If you do that, after a month or so, you can gradually titrate the protein back and start adding the fat in as you go. So for people just interested in like starting keto, and they're, they want to preserve as much muscle as possible. I have no idea if things like branched chain amino acids and things like that there's some data in animal models, the human data, it's a little bit conflicting. I get that question a lot. It makes sense to use it. Your muscles are using branched chain amino acids.
It's not going to spike insulin enough to be concerned about ketosis. We don't think so.
I don't think so. I think, it's, some people use aminos, and I think that's okay, but I think it really just comes down to protein. Up the protein in the beginning and then titrate it down as your body becomes keto adapted. It's as simple as that.
So one of the things that you talked about last time you were on was that you eat a lot of fat in one serving at night. And so this is a kind of a thing that I'm running into now, having started my 30-day keto transformation. Only really eating 2 meals a day. Like I'm kind of forced, or quote unquote forced, to have large amounts of fat at once. How is that going to influence your ability to stay in ketosis? So let's say I'm having, 100 to 150 grams of fat at one meal. Is that like absurd, or is that normal? I think you told me last time you're up to 200 or 300 grams in a meal.
Well, I've done that before, and I haven't seen any over negative consequences. Right, your gut will tell you.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. So for some people, what works for me or you may not work. I do know in my past, I was looking through my old food diaries in 1995, I think, or maybe 96. So it was 2021, where I basically would eat a 2-pound London broil, a sweet potato with butter and everything, and I would wash it down with a Metrix with HMB, and I was actually using MCT back then. I was using the Twin Labs MCT fuel, and I would add it to that or whatever. So right there, you could say, I think it was 200 and some grams of protein for one meal. That was my dinner. And then, 2 hours later, I'd probably eat again. Mm-hmm. I didn't have any, if my carbs were restricted, I didn't have any overt signs that I was not digesting that. But when I did get into a diet where I had a lot of carbs coming in, my gut, my GI system would get disturbed, where it was going through me, and
so I'm talking 150 grams of fat.
Yeah. So I'm going back to that now. So over time, I started titrating the fat in, especially when I started doing this diet, and I was kind of worried about losing muscle and weight and strength and things like that. And on some days where I just couldn't get my calories in, I would start doing that later in the evening. And if I got a lot of protein or certain kinds of fat, I couldn't sleep well. But I've noticed that under certain conditions, especially if my body's hungry, I can get that amount of fat in well over 200 grams and be okay with that, and do that day in and day out, and not see any, in my physiology, not see any overt negative consequences from that.
I see you traveling with a lot of your exogenous ketones, and that's something I've never experimented with, because I'm trying to enjoy and embrace the suffering of the first couple of weeks. It's not suffering, but there's definitely a shift happening in my body. Like cognitive function is a little bit blurred. It's not perfect yet. Tell me about
how I use them.
And also conversely, to someone who's like myself, who's shifting into this keto adaptation phase, what's the best strategy to benefit from them without inhibiting fat loss, if that is a thing?
To transition into it, right?
So I want to have that peak performance.
MCTs are great. Right. Yeah, MCTs are, a lot of people ask me about ketone esters and ketone salts and exogenous ketones, and they have their place, but MCTs are cheap, they're versatile, they stimulate ketogenesis naturally without throwing exogenous ketones in. If you use exogenous ketones, it's good to use them with MCTs, because they delay gastric absorption. You have sort of an extended pharmacokinetic profile with that. If people are just getting into this, I would ask them to suggest to them to just start shifting their macronutrients over. When I study seizures, and we have a child or a situation where you need rapid neuroprotection or rapid anti-seizure effects, then what we do in the lab is rapidly, put the body into a state of ketosis that would look like they fasted for 10 days. And we can achieve that in 30 minutes, right?
With exogenous ketones.
With exogenous ketones.
Are you using insulin at all to induce a lower blood sugar? That was one question that I've got a lot, is if someone has slightly elevated blood sugar, is that something that would, help?
It does. So a couple of the publications that we have and a lot of data that we have in numerous animal models and in numerous ketone preparations is that the ketones are inversely correlated with low glucose. So the higher you push the ketone levels with exogenous ketones, the lower glucose tends to fall.
Wow.
So I thought it was insulin. I thought that, and our normal physiology is when our ketone levels get high, we have ketonuria, and we have the ketones are in the blood, and as they get elevated, there's a small release of insulin, and that insulin will decrease fat oxidation in the liver, and that fat oxidation in the liver is like a rheostat, right? It's not shutting it off, but it's turning down ketone production. So I thought massive doses of ketones, which are not really found in nature, would cause a spike in insulin. And they do, but not to the extent that like protein does, or of course carbohydrates or sugar.
But it will shut off fat burning.
Only, not as much as you'd think. Like it does it more so than fat, less so than protein, and less so than carbohydrates. So it's almost like a happy medium because you can consume exogenous ketones and you get a little bump in insulin that I've recorded in myself, and we're doing testing in animals. And I think that little bump in insulin is actually anti-catabolic, and it can kind of keep pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, the PDH complex, sort of activated, where otherwise it would not be activated. If you took, MCTs or just pure fat, you'd continue to keep that insulin pathway low. Getting back to the point of like, where's the glucose going when you consume exogenous ketones? We see this drop in glucose. We were thinking it was an insulin-induced glucose disposal mediated by the ketone, induction. But we are kind of the opinion now that it's enhancing insulin sensitivity, and so you're getting better glucose disposal through enhancement of insulin sensitivity, and there's different ways that it can do that, maybe through redox signaling or some other pathways. But also it seems to be decreasing hepatic gluconeogenesis. So your liver is the master metabolic regulator, and it's controlled by your brain. So your brain can kind of tell your liver to stimulate gluconeogenesis, and there's a variety of hormones that it does that, and it's like hardwired to our central nervous system, right? I think there's an interesting dynamic going on where the brain is telling the body to sort of spare glucose and to decrease glucose catabolism, and I think it's kind of conserving liver glycogen to some extent, because
when you get these exogenous ketones elevated.
Yeah, and it's massive. It's not like metformin will lower glucose a little bit if it's high. We're talking about taking blood glucose from 120 to 150 in a rat model, and then I have some data on myself and others, down to like 50 milligrams per deciliter, or 60, where that's around like 2.5 to 3 millimolar of glucose. That's like borderline severe hypoglycemia, but you're completely asymptomatic for hypoglycemia. And that's simply by adding a large dose of exogenous ketones in a subject that is not eating a ketogenic diet. So they're eating a carbohydrate-based normal, rat chow or whatever. And we do an intragastric gavage, and we basically stimulate ketone elevation that would be equivalent to prolonged fasting. And we see this rapid decrease in blood glucose, which is very, very interesting. I mean, from a clinical standpoint, that's the implications of that for human health are pretty dramatic, right? Pretty dramatic. So that's probably one of the most interesting things that we see metabolically with ketones, but we need to understand it. Is it doing it because it's, when you drink alcohol, right, you cause a redox shift in the liver where you can get alcoholic ketoacidosis. Right. And that's an alcohol-induced decrease in gluconeogenesis, so that's kind of a bad thing. Are we experiencing that? With the early studies that were done with racemic 1,3-butanediol or 1,3-butanediol acetoacetate diester, we were thinking that redox shift was more of like it was occupying and de-energizing the liver in a way that would do that. But we see this with MCTs, we see this with MCTs and ketone electrolyte preparations or ketone salts. We kind of see it across the board in the different types of exogenous ketones. So there appears to be a signaling effect that no one has characterized yet, that we're working on, even doing things like liver metabolomics, that there's this brain, central nervous system, liver connection, and probably a number of hormones in circulation that is decreasing hepatic glucose output, which is a good thing in many ways, and that's shifting the body to more fat oxidation. So that is a way we could say that exogenous ketones could, in theory, be shifting the body to be more fat adapted just by virtue of lowering hepatic glucose output. I think the small, tiny release in insulin, my insulin went from, on a range of I usually stay around 2 or 3, and upwards of about 6 would be normal. And it pushed me from 2.5 to 3.5. So I'm still below normal. And that's about the largest dose of a ketone salt product that I could take with MCTs. So it's just a tiny bump in insulin compared. If I drink some grape juice or I have some Gatorade, boom, I'm up to 6 or 8.
Right.
So an equal calorie amount.
So
how much? Keep that in.
So there's a lot of things. I got about 30 questions that came to my mind right there. But first, I think the one that's going to come up in everybody's mind is what you say. You say a large dose of ketones, and then from there, I want to differentiate
starvation level ketosis. Yeah.
Okay. So what does a large dose mean? And can you differentiate? Because I had no idea this was even a thing, but between left and right-handed ketones, that some are effective and some are not effective. This is becoming a real thing that people need to be aware of.
It's important, yeah. That's why we're researching it. Yeah. So do you want to do that one first? Dose. Okay. So the dose will be dependent upon. So just dosing, generally speaking. If we take all the different ketone molecules, so you have ketone esters, right? And there's esters of beta-hydroxybutyrate, and there's also ketone esters of acetoacetate. Yep. And the esters of acetoacetate that we work with, the acetoacetate's bound to something, a glycol, dialcohol-like molecule called 1,3-butanediol. And so you have 1,3-butanediol, and we actually put 1 and then 2 acetoacetate molecules on that. When it's ingested, there's a hydrolysis that rapidly releases the acetoacetate, and that spikes the levels up very high in the blood and also the brain. And in the brain, acetoacetate has an anti-seizure effect. It spontaneously decarboxylates to acetone, about 15-20%, and that acetone, opens potassium channels, that hyperpolarizes the membrane, and does a lot of neuroprotective things that I'm interested in from a patch clamp electrophysiologist perspective. So that's what really excites me. So the acetoacetate is elevated. Some of that converts to beta-hydroxybutyrate, and then the 1,3-butanediol goes to the liver, and that's sequentially broken down very slowly to beta-hydroxybutyrate. So you get the spike up in acetoacetate and a slow elevation of beta-hydroxybutyrate that ultimately ends up in a 1-to-1 ratio. So that's the ketone esters that I have most experience with. That's sort of the scenario, what happens there. The maximum dose that I could take of that per day is about 1 gram per kilogram body weight. So I'm 100 kilograms, so that's like 2 or 3 5-hour energy drinks worth of that. Mm-hmm. So if I was going to go into battle or whatever, and I want neuroprotection from oxygen toxicity seizures, if I'm going to do some relatively deep dives with a rebreather, like Navy SEALs may do, and they're in a situation where they have to dive a little bit deeper to evade the enemy, plan a mine, something like that, and they want exercise performance, neuroprotection, so they would take an equivalent, maybe 2 or 3 doses.
So I'm climbing a mountain in 8 to 10 days. I should take that. Might be a good solution for me.
Well, so you are? Are you saying you are?
Yeah, we're climbing.
We don't have. So another interesting project that we're looking into is cognitive resilience under hypoxia or hypobaric hypoxia. Low pressure. Anecdotally, I would say yes, but as scientists, I like to see data.
So do you want me to test my ketos every hour?
You could test it. Yeah.
Every hour on the way up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ideally, I would like to send you with some information to do some cognitive tests.
Yeah.
We use the NIH Toolbox, which is a suite of tests. We use that with our NASA project. Yep. And we use something called Joggle, which they use on the space station. My wife's a behavioral neuroscientist, and that's kind of her wheel box right there, or that's what she focuses on. So doing those tests or some kind of test maybe that you can bring an iPad that does reaction time and things like that.
Fascinating. And would a pulse ox be something I'd want to check too?
Yep. Yeah. Pulse ox would be good. So the little finger monitoring things. I have one I use for Buteco breathing. Like the breathing. Yeah. So that could be helpful.
What brand do you use?
It's the CEO of Quest bought it for me, Ron Penna.
And Massimo or something?
It might be that. Yeah. It's like the best one on the market. It's really good. Yeah. It's great.
Shout out to Ron, man. Ron's awesome.
Ron is awesome. Ron and Daniel Rego. And Tom Bilyeu and Mike too, all the Quest guys, they were instrumental. And kind of, I remember Dr. Peter Attia and I visited them years ago, and kind of.
I love Peter, by the way. Man.
They were already on, sort of on the keto front and educating. They knew a lot more than we thought they would know. But when we talked to them about it and got them a little bit deeper into thinking about this, and not necessarily even from a business perspective, they are purely like, especially Ron Penna is purely into keto just from an intellectual perspective, from a personal perspective from his end, but from the implications that this could have for human health and wellness. So not too many CEOs running a big company like that, or owners of a company like that, have that kind of scientific
I met him a long time
enthusiasm.
ago. I was aware of keto, and I was vaguely aware of Ron and Quest at the time, just when the company had started. And he was telling me all about keto, and all those guys were. And we went out to dinner, and he's eating the burgers with cheese in the bun, and I was like, it intrigued me that a CEO at that level was actually not just thinking about making money. He was actually thinking about, hey, how can I live forever and live an awesome life? And then they were putting money into research for cancer and keto.
They were a lot, with Keto Pet Sanctuary. They have an ebook out there. Go to look up Keto Pet, look up Keto Pet Sanctuary. If your dog, we're huge pet owners. I get a lot of dog questions about that. And they've been very, generous with supporting some things that would otherwise not be supported by, government funding and things like that in our lab, like exploratory research that has real world actionable, implications where when the study's done, this is really, it's important or not important. So they're answering questions. And I think, they've generated the capital that allows them to sort of put money towards answering some of these questions, and they've been very helpful. But getting back to the dosing thing, so 1 gram per kilogram, so 100, however, if you're 60, 80, 100 kilograms, that's an equivalent amount. So that's about the maximum tolerable dose.
So are you able to tell me a brand of that? Because people are going to be able to differentiate. That's the brand that you've got.
Well, the brand that we have a ketone ester that is, we have a licensing partner. So might be an inventor on some of the IP, but our university kind of owns it. And that has not come out as a supplement yet, but there's Human or HVMN is another. That's a brand that's out there right now, and that's different intellectual property, and that is a ketone ester that was really the brainchild or the formulation, the actual structure itself was from Dr. Richard Veach, and he was in many ways a mentor to me and kind of got me into this because I saw that through DARPA funding. And through work that was being done at NIH and also Oxford, that they were looking at 1,3-butanediol beta-hydroxybutyrate monoester. So the same 1,3-butanediol, instead of attaching acetoacetate, they attach beta-hydroxybutyrate to it. And they have the R enantiomer of beta-hydroxybutyrate and the R enantiomer of 1,3-butanediol. So it breaks down, and we could talk about the racemic and R versus the D versus L and the R and S. So that there's a lot of research behind that ketone ester for exercise performance, maybe maximizing glycogen resynthesis, recovery, elevation of ghrelin, suppression of inflammation, probably because beta-hydroxybutyrate does that. And interestingly, a drop in blood glucose, which we talked about, and actually a decrease in insulin. So if you consume it, and this is a really important distinction. If you consume a large dose of the beta hydroxybutyrate monoester, you can get insulin to bump up a little bit. But if you integrate this in with the food and you feed it to rats and you keep the calories the same with a standard rat chow adding 15 to 30% by weight the ketone, or by calories the ketone ester, and you look at insulin goes down significantly, not like 5%. It goes down like 15 or maybe even 30%. Have to go look at the studies. There's a couple different studies. But that's an indication, because you are enhancing insulin sensitivity, your insulin level, is going down. And I think that's remarkable when people say exogenous ketones will increase your insulin. I mean, I think I saw an article, it might have been on T Nation, about that, and it's kind of like criticizing it. What they don't realize is that the rise in insulin is far less than, proteolytic amino acids or gluconeogenic amino and carbohydrates. Fat will not increase insulin, and ketones will increase it, but it's like a minuscule blip. Mm-hmm. And if you chronically eat these exogenous ketones,
they're going to jump on that and run with it, right?
It's going to enhance insulin sensitivity, and your baseline levels are going to be lower. The very strong.
So the implications there for type 2 diabetics or even type 1 diabetics is massive, I would say.
It is massive. It is massive, and I think I don't think any drug compares to it. We do quite a bit. I've used metformin and use it at various dosages on myself, and we do quite a bit of animal work with it. Metformin does not even compare in glucose lowering effect, and I think insulin sensitivity effects compared to exogenous.
So no negative effects though. So you need to throw it at someone who's diabetic, and they're not going to see it.
I think there's always negative effects of everything. So
okay,
that's
so
what we need to know. It's a dose-related thing.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to. When these things are ingested, they do become bioidentical molecules, and your body may be thinking that it's like kind of in a fasted state. Mm-hmm. So does that shut down metabolism? It doesn't look so. It looks like it may actually increase it, but I'm be hesitant to say that it does that. I don't think it really. I think I view ketones as the fourth macronutrient. I said that on Tim Ferriss' podcast, I think, and I've seen that quote around. And sometimes you say things when you're early in your research and you cringe. Yeah. Like the ketogenic diet is the best, diet, or the ketogenic diet is works on every cancer type. And there's things that I said early in my career that I may cringe, because there may be some cancers, for example, that are not responsive, maybe that you wouldn't want to use. But the exogenous ketones as the fourth macronutrient, I think I said it, and it was kind of a flippant thing, and I said it, but I really want to kind of harp on that, because they are a calorie-containing carbon source that is supplying the body with an alternative fuel that is superior in many ways as a fuel source.
That's what I was going to ask. Do we know how many calories per gram in ketones?
It depends on, if we're talking about a ketone salt, right? You have the ketone, and then you have the monovalent or divalent cation or the amino acid or something like that. So it ranges from anywhere from like 3.4 to maybe 4.8 or something like that with a ketone salt. With a ketone ester, the R ester is about 5.8 to 6.2 calories per gram. So fat being 9, and carbs and protein being depending on the fiber source and stuff, being about 4 calories per gram.
That's fascinating, man. Yeah. So, I mean, it literally is, right?
Yeah,
and I think walking forward, that's going to be introduced as the fourth macronutrient.
The fourth macronutrient,
and that's pretty cool to think about.
I think people are starting to kind of use that term a lot more, and I like it. And I think it may help. I think it may change food technology in a way that if this can be, we know that we can take synthetic sources like 1,3-butadiol. It was looked at at MIT, and they looked at it as synthetic space food. So of all the molecules that they looked at, synthetic molecules, it was the most, it had the highest potential to be a synthetic space food for deep space missions, right? There was two problems with it. So one, it had a mild narcotic effect. So if you take 1,3-butadiol, and if you've taken it, you get buzzed off of it. You feel like you've had a drink or two. And if you get above that 1 gram Well, with pure 1,3-butadiene, if you get above 0.5 grams per kilogram, you start to be a little bit euphoric and you get a little bit buzzed. And some people like that. Regardless, it's probably not the best thing to stay super sharp. Interestingly, when you combine ketones with that and make an ester, it doesn't have that narcotic-like effect. But it's mild and you need a lot of it to get that effect. The other thing is that it tastes absolutely horrible. So the
is that what Peter Attia calls the rocket fuel?
Yeah. I know he's tried that. Well, we've worked together on some things. I know he's tried that, and that's a pretty good description of it. But nonetheless, it's 1,3-butadiene is like an awesome versatile molecule that's it's a fuel source. It has some interesting properties in and of itself. And if you mix it in with food, I think in one of the studies published in 1975, they mixed it with like a muffin, and it had a shelf life that was like super long relative to food that didn't have the 1,3-butadiene in it. So it's an FDA approved food additive, generally recognized as safe. So there's GRAS approval for it,
right.
But it's used in small quantities as a humectant, which keeps things moist. And it has various applications kind of in the food industry, but as a fuel source, it just tastes so horrible, you wouldn't want to do it. So we want to like take that. So what we've sort of done is take that molecule, add ketones to it to make it even more ketogenic, because it itself breaks down completely to beta hydroxybutyrate. Right. But we take that molecule and then we do a trans-esterification and add ketones to it to make it more ketogenic and to enhance the pharmacokinetic profile and things like that, to elevate the types of ketones that we want. And we're at the stage now where we're taking that molecule and then we're formulating things like MCTs, various ketone salts, even probiotic fiber that can, enhance short-chain fatty acids and butyrate and things like that, and formulating it such to create various formulas for different conditions, right? And when it comes to dosing, just getting back to dosing again, I know I'm getting off on tangents, right. About 1 gram per kilogram per day is almost universally, so even with MCTs, exogenous ketones, and ketone esters. And I've tried them all in many different doses, and that's about the maximum tolerable dose for me and various other people that I've been working with. And for animals, it could be as high as 10 or 20 grams per kilogram per day for animals. And we've done rat studies, I think it was actually 25 grams per kilogram per day, chronic feeding, equivalent to you or me 4 or 5 years. And we look at liver function, we look at kidney function, we look at, we do a cytokine profile, and everything is going in the right direction. Mm-hmm. Like, it's like, you take lab rats and you calorie restrict them a little bit, and like everything goes in the right direction, because you're almost like restoring their health. Like, you stick them in a cage with no enrichment and you give them ad libitum access to a high carb rodent chow. That basically describes a human condition, right? We're sitting at home, we go to work, we're stressed out, most people don't exercise, simply taking that animal and restricting the calories 10 or 25%, all the biomarkers go in the right direction. So you put ketones in with the rat chow and you don't calorie restrict, you give them ad libitum access, and all the biomarkers are going in the right direction. So maybe even independent of calorie restriction. So these are the things that really excite us.
Right, so we've never seen any negative implications from elevated exogenous ketones in a higher dose?
Yeah, so you could rapidly put an animal into ketoacidosis with something like a ketone ester, like a beta hydroxybutyrate monoester, a ketone diester that Patrick Arnold that I described helped me originally synthesize, a monoester then diester. These are very powerful substances, and people ask me, even families that have kids that have, metabolic diseases like glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome. That's a long name, but it's a disorder where you don't transport glucose across the blood-brain barrier. These kids need to be in nutritional ketosis to stay alive and to really function and be optimized. And a ketone supplement, like a ketone ester, it's like a magic bullet for them. So there are people and populations out there that are asking, well, why is this not approved for a food yet or a supplement. And the thing is that it has this ester bond. 1,3-butanediol is actually found in nature in some plants and things like that, and ketones are found in nature, but there's a bond there that is unnatural, and the FDA recognizes that even if it's consumed, it breaks down into sort of things that are found in nature. That needs to go through a regulatory path that is a tedious and time-consuming and costly process, and we're sort of going through that right now. And I think the HVMN, the human ketone ester that's out there, is very expensive until they scale up. In the meantime, there are ketone salt products. So maybe we can talk about the ketone salt product.
Yeah.
So
not as effective from what I hear, but still.
I would say
useful.
about halfway there. About halfway there in terms of potency. And when we're talking about athletic performance, when I get, above 2 or 3, and I get into the 5 range, I start feeling unwell. Unless I'm like really hitting it hard and exercising, I think you're actually causing a metabolic acidosis that your body has to deal with those excess ketones and is trying to eliminate it. You're peeing out energy, basically. It's almost like, we don't go to our blood meter and say, hey, look how high my glucose is.
Right.
So I see a lot of people showing their ketone numbers. Hey, look how high my ketones are when they're drinking exogenous ketones. That's, you wouldn't do that with glucose. So you're basically putting fuel into a system. You have this excess fuel, and it's got to go somewhere. And ketones are acidic, so they create a metabolic acidosis that your body has to compensate for. So respiratory compensation, renal compensation can usually do that. In rats, we could quickly push that over the threshold and put them into ketoacidosis. No doubt you could do that with a human and kill a human like that with a ketone ester if it's high enough. So that's why these things really need to be, they're very powerful and they need to be regulated. And I'm of the opinion that they should not be on the market yet until we know more about them. Right. I've put enough gallons through me and done enough blood work to know where the limits are, and I could tell you that I could make myself sick. Right. And especially if you flavored it to taste like a Gatorade or something like that, you're going to have problems. You're going to have people in the hospital. Alternatively, I think you could save some lives, and I think you could prevent seizures. You could perhaps even silence symptoms of metabolic diseases, maybe even genetic diseases, things like Angelman syndrome. We have a clinical trial right now. There's a persistent molecular pathology that's causing seizures, causing motor dysregulation, and all sorts of behavioral problems. When these kids are put on a ketogenic diet, it can, knock out the seizures and enhance, their learning and behavior and things like that. It's just super hard for these kids that have this disorder to follow any kind of diet because they're already so picky as it is. With autism, it's like that too. And we know that Susan Massino and Jung Rowe, he's at Calgary now, he runs the pediatric program. They've done a lot of work showing that these ketogenic diet is therapeutic for that. So we want to get things like ketone salts on the market that we know. Now, a salt is not sodium chloride. When people think of salt, they think of, salt and sodium and sodium being bad. Well, that's a whole nother kind of category is, sodium bad and salt bad. I think your listeners probably realize that the FDA guidelines or USDA guidelines for I forget, it's 1.5 or 2 grams of salt per day. Anything above that is dangerous in regards to, blood pressure and many diseases. But I think optimally, we probably need more than 3 grams a day, and it could probably be somewhere around 6 grams a day. I know personally, I kind of feel best, especially here in Florida, getting around 10 grams a day, sometimes. And sometimes I'll get a lot of that sodium from ketone salts. The research on salt is with sodium chloride. So some of the criticisms of the sodium salt is that the mineral overload and the sodium is going to kill us. I think Dr. Veach at the NIH talked about that and maybe have old school thinking about sodium being dangerous. Right. And of course he makes the ester, so the salts are competing with that. But the sodium from sodium beta hydroxybutyrate is different than sodium chloride from table salt. So that should be stated. But a ketone salt, you could take beta hydroxybutyrate and combine it with any monovalent or divalent cation, which could be sodium potassium, and you can balance it so you get a good ratio, or potassium and magnesium. So we work with a quad salt where you spread beta hydroxybutyrate across these different minerals, and you're giving the body electrolytes, you're restoring electrolytes. So it's the optimal hydration formula, almost like a Powerade or Gatorade, but instead of delivering glucose and fructose, you're delivering ketones, right? So you can also make a ketone salt with a alkaline amino acid. So things like histidine and lysine and arginine and citrulline. These things are they're basic, they're alkaline, so they could form an ionic bond with beta hydroxybutyrate. So we can do that. These will not taste good. They're a little bit more costly to make, synthesize. Might be able to make a creatine, beta hydroxybutyrate. So these are sort of some of the things on the table, and this is where the formulations come in. And this is what really excites me, kind of like a kid in a playground or like a lab or sort of where you have
that's got everything you could possibly want.
Yeah, right? So you are, and we work with various chemists at the university and chemists outside the university. Kind of gives us a little leverage to do a little bit more things. But there's a lot of different molecules. I will say, there's companies in there that have all their eggs in one basket, but I'm interested in the 120 different ketogenic compounds that are out there. Screening them from a sort of a top-down approach to figure out what has the optimal effects on performance, neurological effects, neuroprotection, things like that, and then taking the ones that are feasible to produce, that are non-toxic, safety is the major thing, and then taking those compounds and then formulating them into ways that become a totally new kind of entity. And nothing really like this exists this is totally new to the sports supplement market and almost to science in general, right? Because you are talking about a totally different fuel source, a fourth macronutrient, a different source of energy. And creatine was kind of like that too. Right. So when creatine came out, there was a lot of skepticism, and then the science backing up creatine, there's only like 5 supplements out there that actually have like legit science behind it, and creatine is one of them. And I have no doubt that ketones, right now there's an explosion of research on PubMed, but give it another 5 years and then it'll probably top. You got like caffeine, creatine, maybe beta alanine, sodium bicarb, a few other things, maybe 5 that have like legit science behind it. And I think the science behind exogenous ketones is exploding so fast that it's going to be added to that list. You don't want to put the cart before the horse, though. So I'm very conservative when I talk about these things.
Hey, I interrupt this podcast with Dominic D'Agostino to tell you about the 10 fats that you absolutely must have in your cupboard. So whether or not you're on a ketogenic diet, having healthy fats, as you guys now know from all the experts you've been exposed to, is probably one of the most essential tools to optimizing your mind and optimizing your body. So if you're going through a fat adaptation phase or not, these are 10 things that I highly suggest you have in your cupboard, in your fridge, in your home at all times. You don't need to have a lot of them, but having a good, diverse array of fats is very, very important to cellular health and optimal body function. So I've created a list, and in no particular order, these are the 10 fats that you should not be afraid of having. And if it's not on this list, it doesn't mean it's not a good fat. It just means that I don't feel it's the best. So avocado. Now, I believe avocado to be of the best, if not the best fat available to you. It's amazing. Really, really great food, high in potassium, high in fiber. I'm eating a few avocados a day. No bias, avocado's a great fat. Ghee. Now, a lot of people use grass-fed butter. I use grass-fed ghee that I get off Thrive Market. And I like ghee because it has the lactose removed. If you've never tried ghee, it's this really rich, creamy butter, ultimately with no lactose, with no milk solids. So ghee is something that I use over butter, although they're very, very similar. If you're okay with lactose, you're fine with butter. But many people are actually intolerant to lactose and don't know, especially if you're intolerant to gluten. There's been some research that says there's cross-contamination. Olive oil is my favorite. I love olive oil, especially if you have good olive oil. If you don't like olive oil, it's because you've never had good olive oil. And I get some very, very special, fresh pressed olive oil from this company that travels around the world and sends me 3 bottles every 2 months. And I'm trying to get them to send me 3 bottles every week because it's that good, and I feed it to my kids like it's water. Fish oil, obviously you guys know the benefits of omega-3s. Coconut oil, if you're not having some type of coconut oil or coconut products in your diet, there's massive health potential. And I won't get into the details for you here, but that's something I would suggest you add to your list if it's not already there. At least do some research on it. Macadamia oil is one not a lot of people use, but if you're on a ketogenic diet, this may be your best friend. Macadamia nuts, if you've never had them, are maybe the most delicious nuts on the planet. They're incredible, very, very high in fat. So it's not the type of thing that you want to overindulge in, but definitely an amazing source of fat. Whole eggs, free-range eggs, wild-run eggs are incredible, and don't be afraid of eggs because they have cholesterol. It's not an issue unless you're consuming massive amounts of carbohydrate or if your triglycerides are already high, which Dominic's going to talk about. Grass-fed meat and wild meat has amazing fat profiles. So many people in the fitness industry are caught in this paradigm of I want to eat lean meat, so I want to eat chicken and fish, and those are okay, but they're not necessarily better for you. I don't know why people think these things are like completely separate entities. Like, I stop eating red meat because it's bad for me. It's just the paradigm that's misled, just like fats were in the 1980s and 90s. It's silly. Red meat is often more healthy than the chicken and the turkey and the fish because of the fat profiles. There's nothing wrong with red meats. Here's a special one for you: dark chocolate. I know you guys want to hear that, but if you eat dark chocolate, it's actually really, really great for your mind. It's great for fat. It's great for polyphenols, which are fueling your brain. Obviously, don't eat it late at night because there's a small amount of caffeine in there. And last but certainly not least, one of my absolute favorite fats that if you're not already using, I suggest everyone go out and get this. I add it to my coffee in the morning. I add it to my pre-workout, and I'll often add it to meals to allow me to have this quick burst of energy. MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride, which is immediately used for fuel in the mitochondria and can't be stored as fat, so science tells us, which is pretty incredible, and I'm using it every day. All of these fats are available on the sponsor for today's episode, Thrive Market. Now, Thrive Market's mission is to create a marketplace to allow you to access foods that allow healthy living at an affordable price for everyone. So the cool thing about Thrive, like I said in the opening, that these guys are going to give you between 25 and 50% off typical retail prices. And because you're awesome and I like you, you're a listener to the Muscle Expert podcast, you're going to get an additional 25% off and a free 30-day membership. So at the end of this episode, when Dominic stops dropping knowledge bombs all over the place, you guys can head over to thrivemarket.com/muscleexpert. No discount code needed. Enjoy the rest of the show with Dominic. So one of the things you brought up there was that ketones are acidic, and they're
Yep, they can be.
What are the acid implications in a ketogenic diet? So is there something we need to be doing to mitigate some of these potential concerns? And is it a concern that if I'm, people are eating carnivore diets now, people are eating high ketone diets, and is there any consideration or thought that needs to be put into, like, this is actually creating an acidic environment in our body, potentially, even though it's decreasing insulin, decreasing inflammation, is it contributing to disease in any way?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if they are rapidly introduced into somebody in a disease state where they have respiratory or renal compromise, I would say, you could push them into an acidic state that would exacerbate a pre-existing condition. So that's really a kind of an important concept, but you can kind of say that with anything, right? There's other things that do that too. When you drink this, it does create a mild metabolic acidosis. I can get up out of my chair and go into your gym right now and do a couple sets and come back here and create more of an acid load on my body, way more than exogenous ketone supplement, a full dose. Okay, so that being said,
so it's relative.
It's all relative. Right. What is very interesting and probably one of the more intense areas of research is that ketone supplement administration or the ketogenic diet decreases the production of lactate in athletes that actually exercise. And if you just give a ketone ester, for example, and you put a guy on a bike or you run them or you run a rat, the lactate production is about 50% of what. So the acidic load on the body goes down tremendously systemically.
Do you know the pathway of that?
I don't really know. So it uses the same transporter, right? It uses monocarboxylic carboxylic acid transporters. There's like 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in the muscle, I know we look at the ones in the brain. So we look at MCT1. So not to be confused with medium chain triglycerides. Monocarboxylic acid transporters are in the brain and they're in the muscle. And they transport beta-hydroxybutyrate and lactate. So they may be competing. Okay. So one of the thoughts are that the MCT transporters we're showing get upregulated. So you're on a keto diet, you have ketones in your blood, and to your body, to enhance the utilization and transport of those ketones, we make more MCT transporters. So we may have the ability to clear lactate and transport lactate more effectively just by virtue of a ketone-induced increase in expression of MCT transporter protein molecules. So the RNA goes up from that, and then you make more of these MCT transporters that also transport lactate. So there's that going on, but there's also when you're on a ketogenic diet and you take exogenous ketones, PDH activity, I could just say glycolysis goes down. So glycolysis is the glycolytic pathway is basically the driving pathway that kind of creates lactate, right? You know, you're fermenting because you've enhanced oxidative phosphorylation and mitochondrial even glucose oxidation. You've marginalized the glycolytic fermentation pathway with ketosis. So you have less production of lactate just by shifting your metabolism. So there's that, and then there's the MCT thing, but that kind of happens over time. That's more of a compensatory keto adaptation that happens over time.
My biggest fascination in life is this, the evolution of our consciousness, the evolution of our mind, and making sure that we're supporting maximum cognitive performance.
Yep. So me too. So that my background is neuroscience. So that's what my PhD is in. Yeah. And but before that I studied nutrition. So I've kind of come full circle, and I think of ketones as sort of nutritional neuroscience. Like that's still my formal training is neuroscientist. So I'm always gravitated back into thinking, how are ketones affecting consciousness?
Yeah. And so talk to me about that, because that's the reason I'm doing this 30-day keto challenge or whatever. I want to see what it feels like to, long-term and short-term, to upgrade my brain and allow my brain to work on ketones. And is there neuroprotective implications? Is there anti-inflammatory implications? Talk to me about that, because that's very intriguing to me.
Sure. So, I'm trying to think of where to begin. I think maybe the best way to begin is with fasting, right? We've known for, I was going to say decades, but millennia, time of Hippocrates, and even scripture before that fasting was a way to sort of control seizures, to calm the mind in a way that got us into a state of consciousness that gave us more awareness, lucidity, from introspective point of view, and even from awareness of our surroundings kind of point of view. So this is like ancient knowledge, right? That fasting did this. So I'm interested in studying actually what's happening in the brain. There's theories about the default mode network, right? And I guess the big thing now, a lot of people are talking about psychedelic drugs, and the psychedelic drugs, the default mode network is sort of a pattern of neuronal activity that's really linked to executive function. Like I wake up, I got to do this, I got to do, it's almost like a filter that's filtering out things and contributing to certain behaviors and habits that are ingrained in our body, and that's built up over time. And maybe there's theories that different psychedelic drugs knock that out, and we become more of ourselves and more aware of others. Like, I can kind of sense your vibrations and things like that. Sure. Like people study that. Yeah. So I'm actually working with like scientists that are, even at Harvard and Mass General, that are like looking at fMRI, like 7 Tesla, 15 Tesla fMRI images. There are scientists working on this thing and looking at ketones, and they have interesting data that I can't talk about right now, but it'll be in publications probably in the next couple months. It might take a year or so because it'll be a high impact publication looking at the effects of ketones on global brain sort of network patterns. And I have of the opinion that being in fasting ketosis or ketogenic diet or exogenous ketones is altering the neuropharmacology of the brain. So that's kind of what I study and kind of teach. And there's an elevation of adenosine, which is we're looking at that, adenosine A1 receptor activation, and I won't go too much into that because it gets complicated, but there's also glutamate, which is excitatory amino acid transporter, and GABA, right? So glutamate, gamma aminobutyric acid is actually made from glutamate through a GAD enzyme. And the ketogenic diet or ketones activate GAD enzyme. So you convert more glutamate to GABA. And
so it's like a calming effect?
It's a calming effect and a brain stabilizing effect from a metabolic perspective and from a neuropharmacology perspective. Pretty much every neurodegenerative disease or neurological disorder, even autism, probably Angelman syndrome, and other, epilepsy even, are pathophysiologically linked to excess glutamate production, excitatory emergence. And that could be a network effect, or it could be sort of, a decrease in glutamic acid decarboxylase, this GAD enzyme that converts more of this hyperexcitatory neurotransmitter to GABA. And when your brain, I think if we go back to fasting and a ketogenic state, I know for me personally, if I drink a lot of caffeine, like I lose my creative thoughts. Maybe I'm more motivated to get, some obnoxious paperwork done at the university and, animal protocol, all this crap that I have to deal with. I'm more motivated if I drink a lot of coffee and I'm on stimulants to do that. But when my body, if I'm in a fasted state, and I do like very little or no coffee, and my ketones are elevated, I'm very calm, and I can sit down, and that's my writing mode. That's my parasympathetic. I can be sympathetic dominant and be like, I just got to get a lot of shit done, and I get, all this obnoxious paperwork kind of stuff done. Or my body is in a state, and I can measure it in different ways, heart rate variability, where I have parasympathetic dominance, and my mind is calm, and that's the ketogenic state for me. And that's what parents that have kids with ADHD, they send me 2-3 page emails saying this changed the life of my kid. I just took sugar out of my kid's diet and gradually got him on like a modified keto.
That's a hard thing to do with
Not
kids,
only is he behaving better, well, these are parents that are outliers. They're parents that make ketogenic brownies.
Dude,
they actually
that's me.
Okay. Yeah, so you're doing your kid a big favor. And then I guess I'm all about like, okay, show me the evidence. So their test scores kind of improve over time, and to me, I spend a lot of time in the lab and things that are not always necessarily translatable, but when information like this gets out there, and thank you for providing this platform for me to talk about this, and a parent listens to that and they realize, wow, my kid's just been kind of mainlining sugar, and they say he has ADHD and needs to be on Ritalin, and they change his diet up around, and maybe some simple changes to the diet that at first it looks very daunting, to do macros and things like that for parents to do that. But once they do it and they see the effects in their kids, and the fat can be satiating too, and very enjoyable and indulgent. And I'd say about 10% of like parents can do this and actually get their kid on a diet, and they're almost using them to treat a disorder, if you want to call ADHD a disorder, right? But the objective sort of biomarker, if you want to call it that, is like their test scores, is their, the reports that come back from the school that your child's doing much better, he's interacting better, he's, all these symptoms he had, maybe even with autism, if he's on the spectrum, now he's not off the spectrum, and autism score increases. And yesterday I talked to an Autism Foundation for advocacy group, and we were reviewing an early case report that was a casein-free, gluten-free ketogenic diet, and this was implemented in a young girl, Buckley, I think was the mother, and the child went into remission from autism, had severe autism. I think it was like from the autism score like 47 to 17 or something. It was in the literature. And then, a number of things have been done since then. There's some big clinical trials going on, and 2 of my colleagues had the animal model and showed some pretty remarkable effects. So that's a brain calming effect. That's actually changing consciousness. That's a decrease in glutamate hyperactivity to a more calm, GABAergic effect on the brain. There's an increase in what we call Krebs cycle intermediates, or tricarboxylic acid cycle intermediates, things like alpha-ketoglutarate, and these are the precursors for neurotransmitters like glutamate and ultimately GABA. There's redox effects on the brain. There's less reactive oxygen species, less free radicals in the brain with ketones.
So that was going to be one of my next questions that came up, and I'll just segue to that quickly. Talk about that, because is there ROS implications with ketogenic diet that we need to be concerned with?
I think so. Yeah. And I think it could be, in a way, some people describe it as a hormetic effect, right? When you abruptly shift metabolism, it puts a strain. You are actually forcing the mitochondria now to make energy via oxidative phosphorylation when it was getting, 15 or 20% of its energy, or 30 or 40% maybe from glycolysis. You're actually limiting glucose availability and shifting metabolites towards forcing the mitochondria to work harder, essentially. And when you do that, it creates some oxidative stress, and it creates an increase in signaling pathways that can actually increase mitochondrial biogenesis. There may be an initial increase in reactive oxygen species from the stress of the system, because I view the system, I'm a metabolic physiologist, I view the system as a whole.
As everybody should.
Yeah, but nutrition and metabolism is actually kind of more like biochemistry, but I think it should be like the old school guys, or the ones that interest me, like George Cahill and these guys that looked at physiology as a whole. So metabolic, you need to know the biochemistry, but you also need to understand the system as a whole. And there's a lack of appreciation of that because we have a very reductionist kind of perspective.
Talk about it all the time.
Yeah, so this is huge in metabolism especially. So there's this kind of shift initially, which is a stress or maybe an increase in oxidative stress. You are forcing the system to do something that it otherwise maybe is not adapted to do. And over time, you're causing an adaptation like increased mitochondrial biogenesis. So you have a greater capacity to make energy just by virtue of enhancing mitochondrial function over time, and also increased mitochondrial biogenesis over time if you are fat, quote unquote, keto adapted. But the initial transition into that may actually produce some oxidative stress just because there's so many different changes going on, and you're forcing the body to use a fuel source it's kind of not used to doing, and forcing the mitochondria to work harder. And the mitochondria are the source of reactive oxygen species. Right, the first one being superoxide anion, and it comes from the semi-ubiquinose site of the electron transport chain. And the beta hydroxybutyrate actually oxidizes Q of the semi-Q pathway, and if Q is oxidized, there's less of a chance of molecular oxygen from accepting an electron and becoming superoxide anion. And then other reactive intermediates like hydrogen peroxide, and then through Fenton chemistry, the hydroxyl radical, which is very damaging, highly reactive, and causes membrane lipid peroxidation, protein nucleic acid oxidation. So that whole you are shifting redox biochemistry pretty significantly. In the beginning, there's an oxidative stress, and then there's a compensatory decrease by virtue of ketone metabolism, but also by virtue of enhanced mitochondrial biogenesis. And we think an enhancement of endogenous antioxidant pathways. So the ketones function as a histone deacetylase inhibitor, type 1 and 2, maybe 3. And then that can further, just by virtue of sort of opening up the DNA, enhance the expression of various genes that are endogenous antioxidant pathways. So it's actually increasing our endogenous antioxidant pathway. And beta hydroxybutyrate also, in a metabolically independent way, it suppresses the NLRP3 inflammasome. And this is a protein complex that when it's activated, and it's hyperactivated in autoimmune conditions, if your gut's messed up, It's impacted most neurological diseases, cancer. This NLRP3 inflammasome is activated, and when that's activated, it sets off an inflammatory cascade where you have elevated IL-1 beta, IL-6, TNF alpha, things like that. So if we can keep that complex, prevent it from being assembled, and also prevent its activation, we are suppressing systemic inflammation that could otherwise be linked to early onset of chronic neurodegenerative age-related diseases and reactive oxygen species. So we have ketones functioning by enhancing metabolism, less reactive oxygen species. We have ketones functioning as epigenetic regulators by enhancing endogenous antioxidant function. And we have ketones functioning to suppress a well-known but intensely researched, there's a lot of things we don't know, inflammatory complex that's linked to the elevation of these cytokines. So that is all linked to brain health, brain activity, and brain function. And I think it can kind of go back to the whole consciousness thing. If someone has gut inflammation in the gut will cause systemic inflammation, that will cause neuroinflammation, that will cause behavioral consequences like being agitated all the time, being edgy, this is what we see in guys with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. You lower the inflammation and a switch comes on where they're like acting normal, they're behaving with their wives and things like that. So it's a lot of stuff I don't quite understand all the dynamics, but just by looking at the biomarkers and then talking to the person, and the neuroscience that I know is basically showing neuroinflammation is so tightly regulated to what we eat. And neuroscientists need to appreciate that, because we're all about throwing drugs on things. You know, the neuroinflammation is causing seizures and causing depression and anxiety. So it's like whack-a-mole, you know, as all these things come up, it's just, we got a drug for that, we got a drug for that. So if we just enhance, and I'm starting from a metabolic physiology perspective, if we improve and enhance and metabolically optimize the body through, and my way of doing it in some ways is just becoming more fat and keto adapted. And, you know, that's a tool in the toolbox. There's other ways to do it. That is targeting that very aspect right there of neuroinflammation and insulin resistance and hyperglycemia that doctors are playing whack-a-mole and throwing a lot of drugs at. It could completely abolish, if not significantly attenuate, the need for many of these pharmaceuticals.
So it sounds like we don't want to do anything to attenuate this ROS and this increased acidity, because it's a part of the transition process.
It is. That's a really good point too. That kind of needs to happen, right? It's like when we work out, the transient inflammation is sort of the trigger for the adaptive processes that stimulate muscle protein synthesis, right? If we throw on NSAID drugs prior to working out, that may be knocking down, you know, the initial inflammation that's triggering the adaptive processes. So we don't want to do that. You know, I asked the question, like, are we doing that with exogenous ketones? If we're starting a ketogenic diet and we throw on these exogenous ketones, it does not appear to be the case. It appears to be the case that the body is recognizing, that your brain is recognizing, I should say, that the liver is making ketones, and that, hey, we've transitioned to a fasting state. We need to decrease hepatic glucose output, and that will have an anti-catabolic effect. So the catabolic effect of fasting and the catabolic effect of going into a ketogenic diet is that you are giving up, the body is catabolizing gluconeogenic amino acids to make sure the brain has glucose for fuel. But if the brain has ketones for fuel through exogenous ketones, your brain is happy, it's functioning normal, the energetic needs are met, so you're less likely to catabolize skeletal muscle to get those gluconeogenic amino acids, and your body will do that in like a crisis situation. You know, fight or flight situation, you know, is pretty catabolic, right? When you go work out, that's pretty catabolic. Like a little pulse of insulin before you work out is actually, well, it's anabolic, but I think of insulin more of like an anti-catabolic effect.
Right.
And when you take exogenous ketones, I think, and people do it with sugar too. They take sugar and they go work out, but I don't have as good, I'm not as sharp and lucid when I do that. But I do think that the little bump in ketones that you get, maybe from an exogenous ketone product before you work out, would be anti-catabolic just by virtue that your brain is not going to sense a crisis. It's not going to sense the hypoglycemia. When your brain senses hypoglycemia and you have a hypoglycemic crisis, that rapidly catapults you into a catabolic state.
Right.
We've all gotten shaky, hypoglycemia. So ketones abolish, if not significantly attenuate that. And that is, so these things are maybe not talked about, like maybe I didn't talk about, but these are things that sort of I appreciate from tinkering with these things, like over the years. I've been completely amazed that I can stay relatively anti-catabolic off very little calories or even fasting just through exogenous ketones. Like I think it prevents my body, from wasting away. And that's, no matter what, you have to have calories and your body's going to break down. But I think the evolutionary role of ketones, and I think most people probably wouldn't even argue this, that the ketones, their main source of, their main function in evolution of human brain and survival is that they provide an energy source for the brain and prevent the body from catabolizing its skeletal muscle and from wasting away. If we did not make ketones, in 2 weeks we would be wasting away. We would not only break down our skeletal muscle, but our heart. And the body would be doing that to get glucose for the brain.
So this may not be the question, or a question that's perfectly that you're normally asked, but I think you're the perfect person to answer it. Implications of cortisol in ketogenic dieting. So we know that insulin has mitigating effects on elevated cortisol. We remove insulin. Now what's happening with cortisol? So you get these people who are chronically stressed, and we go, hey, we're going to put you on a ketogenic diet. What type of response are they going to get to that? Like, is that going to be inhibitive to their ability to get into ketosis? Is that going to be harder for them to start? Are they going to keep breaking down more muscle tissue? Like someone who's healthy can start converting fat into ketones fast. Someone who's got high cortisol, is that a consideration? And I know a lot of people eat to bring cortisol levels down, right? They have this low level anxiety they don't even know, but they eat because it makes them feel better. They exercise because it makes them feel better. What are the implications of cortisol with ketosis?
So my cortisol level has been low. I just got my results back yesterday. It's only been high when I've put myself in very extreme situations, like the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations.
I can't imagine why, man.
I was a crew member on that space analog mission, living in saturation. Prior to like the early 50s, it wasn't even thought that humans could live in saturation. So things like
that. Was your cognitive cortisol high, or was it your physiological cortisol? Like,
I did salivary,
But were you feeling physically, like cognitively stressed, or was it just a physiological response?
Good question. Well, part of the Nemo 22 mission was to sort of task load you and. When you're in the gym, well, you're always the top guy in the gym. So it's like, if I train with you, I'm going to try to work up to your level, right? So I was basically, my crew members were NASA astronauts who score off the spectrum in like IQ and intelligence and being able to task load. Like our mission commander was Shel Lindgren, and he was on the space station for like more than half a year. And he can do a mini DNA analyzer and sequence the microbiome in like 5 or 6 hours, or like 5 hours. And I'm a scientist, and it takes me like 6 hours to do it. And he's new to it, so and we're task loaded. So we wake up each morning, 6 o'clock, and we work till 10 or whatever. And we're in an environment where I got to like step up my game. And just being around, these people who are just amazing human beings puts me in a stressful state. But there's good stress and bad stress. So it's not like a stress where people are criticizing me. Dominic, come on, hurry up, do that right. You know, you're not doing it right. Do it this way.
Just don't want to
Everybody's
be
encouraging to one
weak
another.
link in the chain.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, I felt like I was kind of the weak link sometimes on some of the operational things, like some of the NASA objectives, but then there was some science objectives too. But everyone was very encouraging. But it was extremely stressful, but it was good stress.
Sure.
So I want to emphasize this, that we need to think of stress. I try to think of stress as, how can I use this stress? Like, how can I leverage this?
Yeah.
You know, even like a negative emotional things, you know, even back, 20, 25 years ago, if I was in a relationship with my girlfriend in my teens or something, and I would break up, I would like get excited because I would be like, well, I can lift more. I can transmutate the word, if you want to use the word. I could transmutate this negative energy into positive energy, and I get massively, I make massive gains in my, academic studies in the gym and things like that. So I try, and that's a big factor, because some people are, maybe fail to do that, and they live in a state of chronic stress, and their cortisol's sort of off the charts. And that happens with me at certain periods in time, and I've measured my cortisol, and it's off the charts. And I think cortisol has a lot to do with our internal representation of our stress stimuli. So we have to lower chronic cortisol levels. Acutely activated elevation of cortisol with training is probably one of the best anabolic stimulus. It's a stimulus that's showing you got a good workout. Mm-hmm. And I even think there was a study showing that like an elevation of cortisol kind of acutely, right, was an indicator of actual like muscle growth and effects and things like that.
Provided it comes down.
Yeah, provided it comes down. So that's why we want to look at diurnal cortisol levels. So I think it's really important, and that's more of like, meditation, biofeedback, relationships, and sort of your whole philosophy on life, whether, philosophical, spiritual, things like that, that can lower your cortisol, systemic cortisol or chronic cortisol levels. And I think that's really important to do. So I think of fasting and the ketogenic diet creates an environment that allows you to pull other levers and make those levers more effective. It creates the neuropharmacology of the brain that has a calming effect in and of itself, but allows the brain to be more malleable and adaptive and teachable for some of these other modalities. So I would kind of put it in that perspective.
Awesome, man. You're doing some really interesting research into cancer right now. So what I asked you when you walked in was, what are you most excited about right now in this ketogenic research? And we talked a little about a lot of stuff, but tell me about where you see this going in the next 2 to 5 years, and what you're most excited about.
Yeah, man, you're asking a hard question, but I'm excited about so many different things. So right now we're actually preparing for NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations 23. And I am a support diver. I am on mission control, and my wife is a crew member for that. And I believe Samantha Cristoforetti and some other, really amazing people will be part of the crew. So we're doing science on that. So my role in all this stuff is actually doing science on gut microbiome. My wife is kind of running the neurocognitive tests, where we do things like NIH Toolbox and Joggle that I talked about. We're using the Oura Ring. My student Andrew Kutnick, who's a big fan of you, powerlifter, type 1 diabetic, actually uses keto, just gave a TEDx talk on keto, should be live pretty soon. Yeah. He's looking at heart rate variability, stress, physiological stress, sleep. So we didn't talk about sleep, but that could be like a whole another episode in it. So we're studying sleep, and we're looking at body composition. So we're using various technologies to do that, calipers and also ultrasound. So that is what I'm kind of really excited about, just because I'm literally immersed in it. I'm underwater,
Yes.
Training underwater. Oh, I'll be a support diver, so I'll be mostly at mission control, but my wife will be kind of living in saturation. So that's consuming most of what I'm doing, like right now and over the next couple months. But my student, Andrew Kutnick, is studying cancer wasting, muscle wasting, called cancer cachexia. So we're looking at the effects of exogenous ketones on having anti-catabolic effects. And the question being, if you elevate ketone levels to starvation level ketosis, but you have like a eucaloric diet, you're not calorie restricting, can you mitigate things like TNF alpha, right, which used to be called cachexin. So it's a muscle wasting, it's an inflammatory cytokine that's involved in breaking down skeletal protein. Can we mitigate that? And can we, at the same time, can we decrease tumor burden and tumor growth and enhance survival? So that's Andrew's PhD dissertation project. So we're looking at that. And from a top-down approach, like what happens to the animals, but from a molecular approach, I mean, he knows more about it than I do, and he should, because he's a PhD student, and he's down into the weeds. I mean, he's doing the molecular studies showing what happens to, like, mTOR, AMP kinase, all these different factors that muscle physiologists study. My wife is looking at the effects of stress with exogenous ketones and pharmaceutical companies use something called an elevated plus maze. So a rat will go out on a little catwalk and basically can fall off the edge, or he can go inside sort of a little cave. And this platform is used to assess fear response and stress. And we've demonstrated and published that certain exogenous ketones have anxiolytic effects. And we think that this buffering of the fear response may have implications, for depression, anxiety, sure, PTSD, things like that. So I'm really excited about that research. I'm really excited about the blood glucose lowering and effect that ketones have. And we're doing some stuff with the Moffitt Cancer Center. We wrote a paper, seminars in biology, to talk about targeting cancer metabolism, or targeting the Warburg effect with the ketogenic diet. Or with nutritional ketosis that could include ketone supplementation. So various anti-cancer drugs target what we call the hallmarks of cancer, right? Invasiveness, proliferation, sort of unbridled proliferation. Some of the new hallmarks would be deregulated energy homeostasis, which we actually knew from Otto Warburg, but they added it as a new one. Inflammation, and also the immune system fails to recognize that the cancer is there, so immune dysregulation. The nutritional ketosis, when properly implemented, hits all the different hallmarks of cancer. So it actually, and this is we think in most cancer types, and that's not me kind of like pulling this out of my ass. There's actually like hard research to show that nutritional ketosis targets all the hallmarks of cancer, especially when the ketogenic diet is calorie restricted a bit. So we're talking about, knocking down insulin signaling, mTOR, invasiveness, metastasis, proliferation, inflammation, deregulation. So the last couple talks I gave, and one was at the Moffitt Cancer Center, and I didn't know how they were going to take it because, you get invited to these things and it's a new idea to them. But I presented sort of this idea of nutritional ketosis targeting all the hallmarks of cancer, and here's like all the studies. And it was like, boom, it like facilitated so many collaborations. It facilitated collaboration on a review in a high impact journal. And now, Moffitt kind of wants to implement nutritional ketosis with their standard of care, not a replacement. And I cringe when I see people online saying the ketogenic diet is a cure for cancer and things like that. No, at the very least, it's taking the foot off the gas pedal of cancer growth, right. But it makes most cancers, and we need to study which cancers are most amenable to this therapy, it makes these cancers more receptive to other modalities, and that could be chemo and radiation, but also immune-based therapies. And what we're really interested in is metabolic-based therapies that are lower toxicity, like inhibiting glycolytic pathways, targeting glucose, targeting glutamine metabolism, and even hyperbaric oxygen. So we know that cancer cells have deregulation of metabolism through defective mitochondria in some ways. Whether they're defective or not, that's a subject of interpretation. Regardless, if you give cancer cells more oxygen, they produce proportionally more superoxide anion, which elevates the oxidative stress in the cancer, in the tumor. And hyperbaric oxygen reverses tumor hypoxia and has some interesting effects on HIF-1 alpha and VEGF and things like that. So saturating a tumor with oxygen knocks down many of the oncogenic drivers, and at the same time, it stimulates reactive oxygen species that pushes that cancer farther, closer to programmed cell death, which is apoptosis. Yeah. And if you throw on a chemotherapy drug or you use radiation, the efficacy of radiation is proportional to the PO2 of the tumor. So if you do hyperbaric oxygen and move that person to radiation therapy, the reactive oxygen species stay elevated for hours after, and it sensitizes that tumor to the damaging effects of radiation. And it does it kind of in a selective way, because normal healthy cells will produce this much ROS in response to 2.5 atmospheres of oxygen, right, whereas an aggressive tumor with a Warburg phenotype will produce this much reactive oxygen species. And these are, I mean, we measure ROS like in the lab. And some of my early observations that I published in Neuroscience in 2008, I think, showed that glioblastoma cells produce proportionally much more superoxide anion and cause membrane lipid peroxidation. We used hyperbaric atomic force microscopy, which I developed as part of my postdoctoral training, to measure membrane lipid peroxidation and protein aggregation like on the surface of the membrane. So that early observation that hyperbaric oxygen selectively sort of increases oxidative stress in these metabolically aberrant cells that I was studying, these cancer cells, stimulated me to think, man, why isn't anybody, talking about this or doing this? And nobody observed this because they don't have, laser scanning confocal microscopy or atomic force microscopy inside a hyperbaric chamber. Right. So they're sort of unique tools that we have through Department of Defense funding. But I started reaching out to people, even leaders in the field now, like Lou Cantley is actually promoting sort of maybe oxidative stress pathways. He follows the ketogenic diet, and he talked about it in his keynote talk. He's going to be one of the keynote speakers in our conference coming up, which is the Metabolic Health Symposium, where we're going to have, basic science researchers and clinicians who have recognized things like nutritional ketosis, hyperbaric oxygen, and also an appreciation for targeting the Warburg effect with drugs. So we just don't study ketones in our lab. We study, many other things, and we're actually intensely focused on pharmaceuticals too that can target many of these aberrant sort of upregulated metabolic pathways in cancer cells. So
it sounds like ketogenics is kind of the offshoot of your study of cancer. That's kind of where you discovered or
it
kind of started.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a secondary thought that just kind happens to have an awesome benefit.
Yeah. For sure. So metabolically, it causes big changes, and then from an endocrine perspective too, by knocking down insulin signaling and associated downstream pathways. And actually, at the conference that we'll have starting January 31st, 2019, to all your listeners, and to February 3rd, 2019, we're going to have. It's actually going to be in LA this year because we're outgrowing Tampa. There's so much interest. So we're going to have basic science clinicians, but we're going to have influencers. I'm going to try to get some of the big names of podcasts that I've been on to come, so we can do podcasts there. That gives them a great opportunity for entrepreneurs, for investors, and for influencers all to interact in a space that's like amazing. We have an amazing kind of venue that we're going to have for this event, and I want it to be about the science. I want to totally, I want the people coming to this to totally geek out on the science like we do, because the science is really what's going to be needed to advance this idea of food as medicine, because right now it's not really embraced and accepted. I teach at the College of Medicine at University of South Florida, and nutrition is not really part of the program. If you're on a curriculum committee for which I have served before, getting nutrition into a medical program is very difficult because you need to teach what's on the USMLE, which is the boards. If it's not on the boards, then the teaching is already so compressed right now, and they have to learn so much. And if you're asking medical students to learn nutrition, which they want to do, they actually contact me. I was like, why don't we have more nutrition? Well, it needs to be on the USMLE test before that. But this conference will basically have top tier scientists like Lou Cantley, like we've had David Ludwig from Harvard, Thomas Seaford from Boston College, my collaborator at Yale, Dr. Deep Dixit, did the stuff with the inflammation and the beta-hydroxybutyrate. And then we have leading guys like Jeff Volek, Stephen Finney may come. We want a big presence of Verta to be there. And we have like the influencers in there, the guys that are doing the podcast like you. We'd love to have you there, and people that are not necessarily a PhD or an MD, but medical students who want to learn about this, because when they get their medical degree, they realize that this is helping cure people and helping people manage otherwise chronic diseases, terminal diseases. So incorporating that into their practice. And that's what we want this to be, a platform.
I know you already kind of answered this question, but I want to ask it anyways. Do you think as a default for the majority of the population that a ketogenic diet is the best or one of the best solutions that everyone should implement at least at some time?
I'll say this.
I gotta throw it out there. It'd be a little controversial, right?
It's a good question. No, I mean, it's a legit question because I think a lot of people maybe want me to answer this question too. It comes up a lot. I will say this: most of the people that are using the ketogenic diet just by volume of email are people that don't necessarily need the ketogenic diet. Right. So they're kind of almost metabolically fine-tuned and optimized in different ways. Many athletes, they look at it as maybe something that could take them to the next level. And I've seen that happen in certain endurance athletes, probably not likely with a sprinter. But when it comes to the normal everyday folk, I guess, I continue to see nutritional ketosis as a tool in the toolbox that can dramatically shift the fuel system of your body, from being carb adapted if you're on a standard diet to fat and keto adapted, with the consideration that you do it for at least 6 weeks. I think after 8 to 12 weeks is when the magic starts happening, at least for me, when I actually felt like normal and actually felt like better and optimized. And everybody's going to be a little bit different with that understanding. So, but one thing though, the more you do it, the easier it gets and the more benefits you'll derive from it. And the same thing holds true with intermittent fasting. So more like my diet over the last couple of years has changed. Like I eat a little more fruit now. I think fruit is a good thing and it seems to be positively impacting. So every day, like last night I had a small orange and I had a half a cup of blueberries. So pretty much every day I have, I have the broccoli, cauliflower, salads, things like that. But I have things like dark chocolate, blueberries. I have dark chocolate and some piece of fruit each day. And of course nuts and stuff like that. But when it comes to carbohydrate, you're like anti-ketogenic.
Paul,
right?
Sorry, what's anti-ketogenic?
Like blueberries, the sugar and blueberries. People think of it, right, but it's all about macros, right? But every day,
it's so low glycemic, right?
It's very low, and I'll get wild blueberries too. But sometimes I'll have like a big bowl, like I'll have a heaping cup of them, and occasionally I have like a grapefruit or something. But we get these little kind of oranges that are intensely orange and have lots of. I think people may be missing out if they're completely eliminating fruit from their diet. Like I get a lot of vegetables, probably more than I got when I was eating lots of pasta and stuff growing up. I probably have more vegetables now on a ketogenic diet. But I've started recently, especially on the days I do intermittent fasting, incorporating some fruit, small amounts of fruit later on in the day. And that may push me from 40 or 50 grams of carbs a day, maybe upwards to 60 or 70 or 100 on some days if I'm really active. And the next day, especially if I'm intermittent fasting, I did that yesterday, and right now, I'm fasting and my ketones are probably 1.5 or something like that, or 2. So I can quickly get back into ketosis. But I know ketone or fruit is something I think has a lot of phytonutrients and it's very enjoyable for me to have it. So
right. Is it a polyphenol thing typically, like a brain enhancer?
It could be. Yeah, it could be. We have a researcher, Dr. Paula Bickford at our university, who did a lot of great work looking at spirulina and blueberry extract, and I think maybe some work with carnosine and some other things, showing like major positive effects, at least in animal models. Something as simple as blueberry extract, and it would be equivalent to like, a quart of blueberries a day, the amount of extract that they gave the animals that have these neurodegenerative diseases, but they're saving, in some ways, saving some of the neurons from some of the toxic effects of these things. So I think her research kind of influenced my dietary. So I've always had blueberries in my diet all through keto, but it went from a quarter cup a day now to a half to a full cup a day. And I'm also testing ketone supplements, and it makes it easier to test ketone supplements if I push my ketone levels below 1. So instead of in the middle of the day, if I'm like 1 or 2, if I comfortably push my ketone levels down, then I have a better indication of what that ketone supplement is doing when I take it. Right. And then I do 30 minutes, 60, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, or whatever, and track that. And it's less, variables to monitor. I get a better sort of read on what the ketone supplements are doing if I push my ketone levels a little down with fruit.
Tom, you do such an incredible job of articulating all that stuff, man. Like, I literally sat here and every question that came into my mind, you would answer, and then would come into my mind, you would answer.
Maybe honestly, we're like synchronized.
Yeah, we're in sync. But honestly, you do such an incredible job of explaining this stuff in a way that like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And there's definitely a lot of terms in there where people are going to be like, I have no idea what he's talking about. But then you always come back around and it's like
they can Google them.
But you always come back around and explain what the application is. So, man, I'm so grateful for you, and so grateful that you took the time to come and teach me and our listeners. Appreciate it. And anything I can do to help you in the keto space. You've done amazing things and continue to do it. So I'm truthfully grateful for you.
Having me on here, I appreciate your sincere interest in this. I mean, you are definitely like into this.
If you ever need a guinea pig in the lab, like all these things you're talking about, I'm like, man, dude, I'm in there. Yeah. I'm in there, like, I'll come and do all these things. It sounds, we're so close. It sounds so fascinating. And, I'm a geek at heart, man. I'm a student at heart. Yeah. And I want to dive into this. And as you speak,
you're a pretty rare breed. I mean, an IFBB pro bodybuilder at the top of the top of the top who is geeking out about this stuff and the types of questions that you have and sincere interest and actually getting all this information that you do with your podcast, getting out to the listeners is really making a huge difference.
Before I was a jock. Yeah. And when you talk about you actually want people at the science conference to understand this stuff, I'm like, dude, like there's people out there like us who actually do want to get it, and we don't. And like the way you explain it, it's almost like I want to sit here with the pathways in front of me, and as you talk, I want to follow.
We can do that. Come to the lab. Yeah, we got a whiteboard.
Literally. Yeah. I'm going to come dive into it with the grad students. Cool. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me back. Appreciate it.
And that's a wrap for our episode today with Dominic D'Agostino. So Dr. D'Agostino, as you guys see, is a wealth of information. I'm so grateful that he was willing to give us his time and come in and educate us on this ketogenic diet thing. And now understand, I'm not a zealot for ketogenic dieting. Do I think it's a tool in the toolbox? As Dominic and I talked about, everyone should have some capacity to use fats for fuel. And a ketogenic diet is just the fastest way to attenuate that uncomfortable phase of shifting from glucose utilization into predominantly fat utilization. So some of the things we talked about today, how much fat is too much fat in one sitting. So I've actually been experimenting with this on a regular basis because right now I've been playing with keto. I've been playing with intermittent fasting, only really eating 2 meals a day some days I eat 4. So when you're eating 2 meals a day, or sometimes it's 1 meal a day, you got to try to get quite a bit of fat into one meal. Otherwise, you're going to lose a lot of weight really, really fast. So I've been upwards around 150 to 200 grams of fat at a meal. That's a lot. And I'm not quite sure if it's the best idea, but I'm experimenting. I'm a self-experimenter. And I'll let you guys know. The more I find out, I'm about 15 days into this ketogenic experiment, and my ketones are actually starting to get elevated now. It took 15 days for them to get elevated. They were up, so I had them up to about 0.8 millimoles. But now we're up to about 1.7 this morning, which is great. It's been about 2 weeks. So I'm feeling a difference. I'm feeling great. I'm sleeping really, really well. I feel much less inflamed. Yesterday, I fasted the whole day. Felt great. Today, to be honest, I'm a little bit slow. I need some ketones in my life. But again, it's just all an experiment. Ketone supplements. Now, understanding that these things can be an amazing tool, and I've not experimented with them personally, but I'm sure Dominic has, and he's a great resource whom I trust his opinion. So as far as decreasing blood glucose, decreasing serum insulin levels, it seems like it's a great tool to start bringing down those factors, those markers. And what's the benefit of that? Obviously, if those are down, potentially increased fat burning. So especially if you're someone who's measuring those things, I would suggest checking out some ketones. Are there negative effects? Maybe. We still don't know. So it's not something I recommend you guys fuel your life on. We got into talking about cortisol. And now that's a really big thought for me because I live a pretty busy life, as I'm sure a lot of you do. And cortisol on a ketogenic diet was one of those questions that I really wanted to dive into. And I don't think we got as deep into it as I'd like because ultimately, if you're not having the carbohydrates, some people are going to get elevated cortisol acutely, which means short term. So for me personally, I found it's actually been able to keep me calmer once I've actually started to get a little more keto adapted. So, and when I say calm, I'm talking like I'm a busy guy. Like I'm always moving, meeting after meeting, workout after workout, like the days are full. So it's not that I'm stressed psychologically, it's that it's just constant movement. And when your body's just constantly doing stuff, your cortisol is going to be elevated. So I was a little concerned with elevated cortisol being kind of a perpetual thing, but it doesn't seem like it has. And I have been testing it. It seems to be pretty rhythmic. It seems to be kind of following this natural circadian rhythm that it should, being high in the morning and dropping off as the day goes on. So I'm happy to say that that's a positive outcome that I've achieved so far in just 2 weeks. Without further ado, I'm so grateful for you guys for turning into this episode and enjoying my conversation with Dominic D'Agostino. And you're probably going to want to go listen to it again. That's one of the comments I get the most from the previous podcast with Dominic D'Agostino. Was like, I listened to it 4 times. So much information. And as always, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please share it with at least one person who you know will love it. Have an amazing day. Live your greatest life today and every day in your greatest body.